Ross Cameron is a former Liberal Party member of federal parliament, representing the division of Parramatta from 1996 to 2004. During his time in active politics, he served 3 terms under the Howard government as Parliamentary Secretary to the Treasurer Peter Costello. Since leaving politics, Ross has worked as a political commentator for the Sydney Morning Herald, the ABC, and as an anchor for the Outsiders program for SkyNews Australia, along with Mark Latham. Known as a classicalist, Ross is known for his love for the ancient world, especially Marcus Aurelius and the sages of Greece. He has also become known for his accurate political predictions against the perceived narrative and predicted Brexit, the Trump Presidency, and the Scott Morrison 2019 upset. Recently, after criticizing the Liberal Party New South Wales state government, Ross was punished with a 5-year suspension. This resulted in his resignation from the Liberal Party and joining the Liberal Democrats, and who eventually elected him president of the New South Wales division.
My father developed rheumatic fever as a child, and that meant the family had to move to Sydney. And through a curious set of circumstances, which is a sort of a separate story, my father dropped out of school without getting a leaving certificate at sort of the age of 15, but subsequently got a job as a youth organizer with the Liberal Party under the influence of a guy named John Carrick, later Sir John Carrick, who was the education minister in the Fraser government, but subsequently was also most famous as a very long-standing state director of the Liberal Party. And he acted as a kind of mentor to my father and to many others, including John Howard. And my dad went back to school, matriculated as a mature age student, got into Sydney University where he studied law, did a master's in jurisprudence, and lectured in equity and jurisprudence at Sydney University before going to the bar, and then into the New South Wales Parliament, where he was for 17 years. And during that time, initially, as a member of the Liberal Party, until he subsequently, like his son, fell foul of the powers in the Liberal Party, who began a persecution campaign against him, which eventually saw him leave the party and join the Call to Australia party, and indeed get elected to the New South Wales Upper House under that party. So my home was, my apprenticeship, if you like, was really the kitchen table. And our home was a place of constant debate and discussion on political and indeed other, metaphysical, philosophical, historical issues. So while politics seems to many people like a kind of foreign environment, to me it was a fairly natural one, because I had grown up sort of absorbing it by osmosis. And so I studied economics and law at Sydney University, and got a job working firstly as an associate to a judge in the Papua New Guinea Supreme Court. Then subsequently, I got a job as an intern for a United States Senator in Washington, D.C., a guy named Mark Hatfield, who was a dovish Republican from Oregon. Then I came back to Australia and went into a government relations consultancy in Tasmania with a bloke named Guy Barnett, who subsequently became Senator Guy Barnett in the federal parliament, and we wound up serving together in the legislature. Then after that, I went to work as a political staffer to Bruce Baird, who was then the Minister for Transport and the Olympics. And after a while working in Bruce's office, I sort of realised if I was ever going to practice law, I actually needed to go and get on the tools and learn that trade, or else I would be joining too far behind my peers who had gone straight into sort of Allen Hemsley or Mallison's or whoever it was. So I left Bruce's office to join the firm then called Blake Dawson Waldron, now Ashurst, and worked there for 3 years as a solicitor. But I ran for pre-selection against Barry O'Farrell at 28 when Bruce Baird resigned the seat, and Barry beat me by 62 votes to 60. And as a consequence, that was sort of regarded, though, even though I hadn't won, it was regarded as a good first outing for a sort of unknown 28-year-old. Then when a vacancy, the Liberal Party had actually pre-selected a candidate for the federal seat of Parramatta, but for a range of reasons, he resigned as candidate, largely under pressure from his wife, who didn't believe he could win and didn't want to move to Parramatta. So I got a call late one night, actually from Tony Abbott, who said to me, look, there's a vacancy. They're going to have to run another pre-selection. I think you should put your hand up. So I did. I won the pre-selection, and 6 months later, I was a member of Parliament.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And you deciding to join the Liberal Party, was it purely that was your environment growing up in it, or was it your own conscious decision, one over Labor, or?
Yeah, well, I think we'd say it's a combination of the two. We find if we look at the data that a person who is born into a Muslim family is very likely to grow up and identify as a Muslim. Likewise, the strongest indicator of a person's voting intention is really their parents' voting habits. And we do tend to sort of absorb our political preferences and prejudices with our mother's milk. But I had a high regard for my father. I admired him, but not least because I didn't regard him as a sort of a hackneyed ideologue, but a person who was his fundamental commitments were beyond tribe and party. He was a bloke who was committed to reason and a believer in the distinctly sort of Western traditions of, the common law, the presumption of innocence, the belief in the importance of the study of evidence, the value of a judicial temperament, forming judgments based on facts, being willing to hear alternative opinions, showing respect for dissent. And so they were really the more fundamental values which I absorbed from him, which placed me, I suppose, on a spectrum I might describe as somewhere between conservative and libertarian. I see them as really two sides of the same coin. And so it was natural for me, in part because I had all of the relationships within the Liberal Party that are inherited by someone who is the child, in my case, son of a member of Parliament of sort of 17 years, and he was the Speaker of the New South Wales Legislative Assembly and Deputy Leader of the Liberal Party. So you inherit all of that as a bit of a head start on the competition. So I think also at that time, the Liberal Party actually still believed in its mission statement. And now it retains the statement but doesn't believe in the values. So it became increasingly difficult for me to remain a member of the party.
Right. Well, that kind of goes nicely with my next question. How has the Liberal Party changed since the days of the Howard government?
Well, look, I think it had already changed by the time of the Howard government. I mean, we look back on the Howard government today because the Liberal Party, state and nationally, is in a state of such disarray and sort of moribund dissolution that the Howard government looks, by contrast, like the very gold standard of a party that believed something. But indeed, the further we get away from it, I think there are many aspects even of my own performance as a backbencher and junior minister in the government, which I think already reflected a very significant drift away from the party's foundation values. Daniel, every organisation over time is at risk of becoming self-serving. It may be established with a mission to reach the world, but the temptation for the organisation to serve its own interests rather than the interests of its members is always real. And whether you're in a company, a charity, a church, or a government, or a political party. And what happens is the party itself enjoys a range of privileges and has a range of assets. And the individuals in the leadership can, over time, become more preoccupied with building their own sort of power base within the party than with the party's actual mission statement. And the Liberal Party essentially is a bit like the tortoise that got flipped over by, I would say, a group of lobbyists and professional careerists who could see that it was a powerful brand that was going to attract sort of a third of the primary vote in any election by habitual behaviours of the electorate. And that therefore, if they could take control of the franchise, they could deliver a range of benefits to themselves and each other in the form of lobbying contracts, rationing access to ministers, getting jobs as staffers, and indeed the ultimate prize, getting pre-selected to Parliament. And effectively now, the other great challenge for any political party is the seductive power of the state. That the state likewise is capable of shearing off its democratic moorings and acting in the interest of the state rather than in the interest of the citizens. And that's what's happened in Australia. So the mission creep of the state, it just grows and grows as a percentage of gross domestic product, and it has unlimited ambitions in its desire for control and its desire for revenue. And what the state does is it seeks to seduce the political parties to join the side of the state against the citizens, rather than those parties representing the citizens against the state. And so now you find with both major parties, Liberal, Labor, and I would include the Greens, they're virtually indistinguishable from the interests of the state. And they are entirely sympathetic and supportive of each new sort of power grab. So right now, for example, the Albanese government is proposing a completely draconian new measure to control public speech, which is described as a crusade against misinformation and disinformation. It's an absolutely Orwellian proposition. It flies in the face of 1,000 years of the British common law enshrining the principles and conventions of free speech, dissent. Yet that legislation is not original to the Labor Party. It was first introduced by Paul Fletcher, the Liberal Party's communications minister, about 4 or 5 years ago. So that just tells you that both major parties have had this complete implosion. They have both fallen like the antlion's conical sand trap. They've just fallen into the state, and they no longer possess any natural ligaments or cartilage of their own philosophical ballast. They're just, like the chameleon lizard. They just take on the color, texture, and form of the state.
Would you say that is inevitable if you stay there too long? If a political party lasts, 100 years, 200 years, or something like that, or even a government, you come to power with all the best intentions, but you stay a bit too long, you end up becoming disconnected, arrogant. So is that type of thing what you described? Is it unavoidable?
I would say it's an absolutely permanent tension. Yes. I think it was Lord Acton who said that power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And I have to say to you, Daniel, that I was susceptible to the same form of corruption, and I found, as soon as you arrive as for example, when I was eventually promoted into the ministry, the most junior of the parliamentary secretaries, but my department had the biggest budget at that stage. I was parliamentary secretary to Amanda Vanstone, who was Minister for Family and Community Services initially, and then subsequently I was promoted to be Peter Costello's parliamentary secretary in the Treasury. But the first thing that happens is the secretary of the department comes to greet you. You get moved into a bigger office. The head of parliamentary services will come up and say, well, now you're entitled to a more powerful motor vehicle. Then they will say, now we need to give you an additional mobile phone. And here's what's the account number, because we need to increase your salary. And here are the candidates the department would like to offer you for your new staff member, the departmental liaison officer. And all of this, inevitably, then you get the title, the Honourable, that goes in front of your name, whether it is borne out in fact or not. And, the feeling of being important is very seductive. And, if I just give you one example of the way the machine works, I was responsible for a program when I was appointed to be Amanda Vanstone's parliamentary staffer. It was called the Emergency Relief Program. It was one of the smallest programs in this massive department, only $30 million. And the program's architecture was designed to help stop people falling through the cracks by doling out $30 million to to the Salvation Army, the Smith family, St. Vincent de Paul, somebody else, and a couple of local charitable organisations in each federal member's electorate. And so if a person was about to get evicted from their home because they couldn't pay their rent, you could go along to one of these charitable organisations, and the government had a budget there to give them up to $500 in a special case to avoid this misfortune. And the money was doled out by about 700 volunteers around the country, whose greatest pleasure in life was to interview the applicants and to say to them, well, are you a smoker? Are you going to spend this money on cigarettes? Do you have a gambling problem? You're not allowed to spend this money on gambling, and they would give out vouchers to people to go down to Woolworths, and the candidate would then wind up getting to the front of the queue and presenting the voucher from the Department of Community Services. And the girl behind the cashier would then say, you're not allowed to buy dog food with this voucher. So then the person would have to take the dog food out of the can, walk it back while the queue is building up behind them, right? The cashier is holding the welfare voucher. Then they would say, pick up the microphone. Can the manager come to aisle 3? Okay. The manager will turn up. By then there's a queue of 8 people. Are you allowed to buy chocolate with a Department of Family and Community Services welfare voucher? Right? The humiliation taking place, in the whole. Eventually, I found that there was a small group of people who had figured out how to game the system, and 90% of the revenue in the program was going to a group of people who would just go from the Smith family to the Salvation Army to St Vincent de Paul. And under the privacy legislation, none of those agencies were allowed to talk to each other about who they were giving the money to. Mm-hmm. So 90% of it was going to a small group of hardened routers, and 10% was going to people who might actually need it. And in order to get it, they were suffering humiliation so much greater than the $50 to $500 they would eventually receive that I just formed the view the program should be abolished. So I made a recommendation to abolish the program. And then Peter Costello called me into his office and he said, well, Ross, you understand this is the only program you're responsible for? And I said, yeah, I do. He said, so if you abolish it, you won't actually have an executive job. And I said, yeah, that's correct. And then he said, well, I think you better meet with your head of department before you proceed with this harebrained idea. So then the head of the department comes to see you and he sits you down and says, Ross, I hear, he doesn't say Ross, he says, Minister, I hear you want to abolish the only program you're responsible for. I say, yes. And he says, well, why do you want to do that? And I say, well, because I think it's counterproductive. I think it's being thoroughly rorted, and I think it's a complete waste of money. We should save the taxpayers the $30 million. And he said to me, well, look, I'm going to give you a number of things just to think about before you pull the trigger. And he said, number one, $30 million is a rounding error in this department. He said, we don't get, we spend $140 billion a year. Secondly, he said, you just have to consider the fact that the program, he said, I really agree with you with most of your criticisms about the operation of the program. He said, but actually the program is for the 700 volunteers. It's not for the recipients. It means that all of these people in these organisations head off to the St Vincent de Paul counter each week, all excited because they've got an important job to do, which is to dole out money to the poor. And he said, if we take it away from them, there's going to be a revolt nationally from those organisations and those volunteers. And he said, it'll go straight to the Daily Telegraph And the headline will be, Liberal government takes money from the poorest of the poor. And he said, you need to appreciate that every single one of your colleagues is going to get hundreds of representations begging them not to shut this program. And they're all going to come straight back to you, and they're going to come to me, and we're going to have to answer all of those questions. And he said, I just don't think they'll thank you for it. And, you know, in the end, I rolled over. And the state rolled me. And I was a libertarian, a liberal. And even though I had absolutely no confidence that the program was helping anyone, I continued its operation. And that's what happens basically to every minister.
Yeah. Yeah, especially coming from the Liberal Party, which is, its brand is basically anti-big government and economic rationalism, work within the budget, and even they seem to be afraid of the perception of the media and the public and everything else. So and especially if I would imagine if you're a young minister, I mean, the fact that you already was willing to at least initially try to abolish your own job when you could have easily just stayed on the gravy train and go, okay, well, I have a job, so who cares? I as commendable that is, I can imagine the pressure of a young minister having senior people in the party telling you basically don't do it, or we're all in trouble, and therefore you're in trouble. So yeah, as easy as it is to say, oh well, don't roll over, principles first. You can, and there's, I don't think people understand the pressure individuals are within the actual government or party.
Yeah. Well, this is why the libertarians are sort of divided into two schools, where there are those who want a much, much smaller government, who would say, we might aim for a government that consumes 5% of gross domestic product. At the moment, it's about 35%, maybe more, when you include local, state, and federal. But there is another group who are sometimes described as anarcho-capitalists. They're followers of Murray Rothbard. And they say that, look, what you really actually have to aim for is the complete withering away and dissolution of the state. And every single thing the state does, whether it's roads, rubbish, police, courts, defence, you must find a private sector alternative to. And their argument is actually quite sophisticated and increasingly plausible in my mind, and I'm growing increasingly attracted to it. And what they say is that the state simply cannot help itself from wanting to grow and strengthen its own position. So wherever it starts, it's going to grow, and it's going to grow rapidly. And the only thing, you realize is, say, even, for example, during the Howard era, while we give them points, we give my own government points for balancing its budget, we have to accept the fact that the size of the state continued to grow at essentially the same rate as it had grown for the 10 years before it arrived. So there was no impulse or impetus within the Howard government even to contain the growth of the state, let alone reduce its size. And I just say to you, Daniel, that there is nothing more difficult to kill than a government bureaucracy. And there is nothing more powerful than the setting up of an automatic funds transfer payment to a government department or one of its agencies. And once you set it up, you'll almost never be able to turn it off. And I say, I know you're a bit of a student of foreign policy as well, and I just say to you that NATO is a classic example of a bureaucracy without a mission, but with a very, very powerful automatic funds transfer from about 26 countries that just goes ka-ching, 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 ka-ching. And with the money in the account, it looks around trying to invent a purpose, which usually involves starting a new war, because what else are you going to do with all of those hundreds of millions of dollars?
Well, it's very similar to what I think Reagan said. A bureaucracy is the closest thing of immortal life on Earth, or
Yeah.
It proves to be very true. With anybody say something or?
No, go ahead.
In regards to the Liberal Party, or not even just the Liberal Party, but also I suppose the whole political class, is there any chance of reform, or are they doomed, for example, to go the way of the UK Conservatives and become Labour light? So
look, I think that's where they are now.
Yeah.
I mean, if you look at the Liberal Party Victoria, especially, the Liberal Party Victoria is essentially competing with Labor to see who can be more progressive. When you had one member of the Liberal Party of Victoria was prepared to stand up with the Let Women Speak protest march, simply asserted the importance of preserving the rights of women. For example, to compete against women in sporting contests and to have their own sort of hygiene bathrooms, the most fundamental basic elements of civil society. John Pizzuto, the leader of the Liberal Party of Victoria, sought to expel Moira Deemer from the party for turning up to an event to defend the rights of women. And the joint is now so completely decrepit and so daftly responsive to whatever the latest woke meme is that it is indistinguishable from Labor and the Greens. Every organism, indeed, every human being, we're born, we grow, we decline, and we die. And the Liberal Party, it will go the way of all flesh, as we all will. But your question is a good one. Can it be reformed? And you look at organisations, like the Catholic Church, for example, which has gone through phases of, I would say, passionate, pure conviction and commitment to its mission in people like, Augustine, Francis of Assisi, and St. Thomas Aquinas, Sir Thomas More, and others, but then has also fallen into these phases of complete internal focus. The current leadership of the Catholic Church, I'm not even sure if the Pope believes in God. He certainly seems to believe in climate change much more than he believes in God.
I actually, excuse me, I actually call him the Marxist Pope. I think he has background in the liberation theory.
Yeah.
And when he came to power, I was never really, straight away, something bothered me about him. And we've seen how he's acted since he got in. And yeah, it's definitely not upholding the traditions of the church.
Yeah. Well, Jesus said, if the salt loses its saltiness, it has no use but to be cast into the street and trampled underfoot. And Jesus is talking about this exact problem, that the salt it may retain the form, the crystalline structure, the color, even the scent, but if it no longer is salty, it has no value, and that's really where the Liberal Party is now. But it's a fair question: can it be reformed? And indeed, people who I respect were critical of me for joining the Liberal Democrats because they said you should remain and reform the Liberal Party. This is Tony Abbott's view. No matter how bad it gets, you should never leave it. And I'm sure he would take the same approach. I think he's influenced by his Roman Catholicism in that regard. I think there are moments where you can't actually collaborate with the Vichy party. You've actually got to join the resistance if you want to be part of the solution. And look, I think there is a movement. I'm not dismissive of movements within the Liberal Party to reform the joint. I think it is possible, is the answer to your question. I have formed the view that it is possible. There is a path I can see. But I've joined the Liberal Democrats. I joined as a happy foot soldier, just as a ordinary member, labourer in the vineyard, with some reluctance from me. The party has elected me its New South Wales president, so I prefer to discuss the glorious attractions of the Liberal Democrats than the defects of the Liberal Party, which is liberal in name only.
Mm-hmm. Well, having said that, what would be your assessment of the current landscape of Australian politics altogether? Can we have a breakthrough moment of a third party, in this case the Liberal Democrats, actually making some headway?
Yeah.
In other words, could Australia experience its own version of a UKIP / reform party within its in its chambers?
Yeah. Well, Daniel, I think you're asking good questions. You're asking the right questions. I would say to you that if I detach myself from the equation and I was an alien landing from an adjoining galaxy and just studying the pattern and the facts, I would say that what we understand Australian as, say, the Australian nation, or indeed Western civilization, is on a trajectory of very rapid decline. That it's like an aircraft which is approaching stall speed and will shortly turn its nose towards the earth and plummet to its own destruction. The chances of turning it around, in my judgment, are slim. The Scottish philosopher David Hume, the anchor and flower of the Scottish Enlightenment, wrote an essay on the progress of the arts and sciences, and he did so from the perspective of an historian who had written history of England from Julius Caesar to the Revolution of 1688. So he had 17 centuries of perspective on the issue. And he said, what you see is cities and cultures that are born and as a confluence of factors which are a bit mysterious, but he described what he thought they were, one of which, interestingly, was a very explicit commitment to freedom of speech and of the citizen by the government, whether it be of a city or a nation. But he said they follow this pattern where they rise, they reach their apex, and they begin to fall. And he was then pessimistic. He said that once the decline begins, there are very, very few examples of a culture that manages to turn it around. Now, I would say to you that Rome, speaking of Julius Caesar, I mean, after the murder of Julius Caesar and Mark Antony, Rome had gone through 3 civil wars in, about 7 decades, and it looked to be on its last legs. Augustus came along and turned the joint around for another 200 years. So from -8 BC to the death of Marcus Aurelius in 180 AD, you had, indeed, Marcus was the last of the 5 good emperors, and you had some absolutely outstanding leadership. I think Australia has a death wish, and I don't really see any strong impulse to turn it around. But I have...
So sorry, when you say death wish, what examples can you give exactly?
Yeah.
Well,
the most immediate, irrefutable, obvious one is the demographics. That, just to maintain your population and culture, you need birth rate of 2.1. And we are now at, after COVID, we've fallen down to about 1.6. So what that tells you is we don't even have the virility and self-belief to reproduce our own population. So that becomes just a very, very simple mathematical equation where if you take this 26 million Australians today, right, we just project forward at requiring 2.1 for 0 population growth, but we're only getting 1.6, and you just see this sort of grim reaper just going through the culture purely in terms of birth rate until the thing ends with a whimper, not a bang, when the last human can't find a mate. So if we go, so that's the biology. Now we can pretend through a Ponzi scheme of immigration that we are addressing that problem by different means, but it does mean that we're importing somebody else's culture. It's not our culture. And what it means is we don't have the self-belief and virility to reproduce our own culture. So therefore, we've signed our own death warrant. We don't require to be invaded by some other power because we've given up. And interestingly, the birth rate is continuing to fall. The only thing falling faster than the birth rate is the rate of production of testosterone among the males, which has fallen by 50% in 50 years. So the causes of that are more complex, but it has the same consequence. It's the death of culture. But if we go to drill down to the next level, an economy, the barometer of an economy's opportunity for productive growth is the cost and reliability of energy supply. And so we have state and federal governments all over the country, indeed local governments, doing everything they can to destroy the reliability of Australia's energy grid. And we are just pulling out coal-fired. We've only got 23 coal-fired power stations. We're pulling, 23 megawatts. We've got probably less than 23. Maybe there's, I don't know, I suppose there's 15 or something. We're pulling out the baseload generators, but we've got absolutely no replacement for them. So we're sitting around blowing up a coal-fired power station while desperately hoping the wind will blow to spin a turbine, which is going to run at 22% efficiency over its life cycle. Well, that's a culture with a death wish. That's a culture with no desire to compete or survive. That's Australia today.
Unfortunately, I could also add a few more things. For example, I was very disheartened and disappointed about the majority of Australians during the lockdown and the whole mandate era too, where with the majority, they seemed to be completely on board, and they were okay with the idea of the camps. Some were even openly advocating for mandatory injections.
Yeah.
And the protests, big as they were, I always felt they were more like a storm in a teacup, where if you get out of the protest view and look at broadly more Australia society, I think the majority of the people were okay with the government. I mean, when they had a chance to show their anger at such things, they instead of going for one of the freedom parties, for example, the Liberal Democrats, the Libertarian, now Libertarian, One Nation, or whoever else, majority of them elected the same people that hurt them.
Well,
It's very concerning how Jordan Peterson talked about the book of what was it called? Ordinary Men, I think it was called. Basically, it was during World War II, like when the Nazis just got into power, and they had everyday people going out and supporting them, or even going along with the policies. This is prior to the indoctrination of the youth. And you go, well, that was everyday people. They're okay with the authority, and I think we had a taste of it, of that type of thinking happening here too.
Well, I think you're absolutely right, Daniel, that a key moment in the COVID hysteria was the re-election of the Labor government in Western Australia. And you had a Labor premier who was leading a kind of segregationist island hermit kingdom, hyping up the fears of the pandemic, literally proposing a, quote, zero COVID policy, which was obviously and always madness from the very first moment, the expression zero COVID. You had that daft girl in New Zealand, Jacinda Ardern running the same rubbish. But Australians fell for it, and Australians were complete suckers. And the problem was when the Labor Premier Mark McGowan got re-elected with a massively increased majority, all of the other premiers said, "Oh, this is the way to go." And in effect, the decision they came to was that the harder you lock down, the more you stigmatize the non-compliant, the camps, the mandates, the injection into children of experimental drugs, which it turns out are killing them. Australians loved it. And I recall listening to Dr. Pierre Curie, who was one of the leading global medical skeptics. He said that when you look around the world, at the COVID response, he said there were 3 countries that completely lost their minds. And they were, he said, take your pick in order of precedence, Canada, New Zealand, and Australia. So here we have been indulging this sort of national fantasy of the sort of man from Snowy River, the Clancy of the Overflow, the rugged, independent, self-reliant, bush Australian. It turns out we're the greatest bunch of gutless cowards on planet Earth. And for that reason, we've got no impulse to save ourselves. We are like so many sheep in the race walking into the concentration camp. And we have zero impulse to resist the guards. Indeed, we're competing to be more compliant. And, I'm going to have to leave you to it, Daniel, now, but I hope I haven't depressed everyone. I do say that, you get the biblical story of Jericho, one of the oldest cities. Some say is the oldest city. We're not quite sure, but Jericho certainly had permanent occupation about 9,000 BC. It had the most impressive walls of any city in the ancient world. But you get this sort of Hebrew story, of the resistance marching around the walls, as it turns out 7 times. And no doubt they were mocked and even probably had moments of disbelief themselves on the first 6 rotations, but they kept marching. And I guess I would say that I feel, whilst I have breath, I'm a very compromised figure, as confessed to you already during my time in government. But I think so long as I have a few libertarian brethren who are prepared to put up their hand and say, no, we're not buying this, we are in dissent, we are asserting the right of citizens to freedom of thought and speech, freedom of association and movement, then I think we sort of have a duty to keep going. And I think it's not impossible that the West can be woken from its slumber. As you mentioned, we have kind of forgotten so much of our legacy. I will conclude with a thought from Boethius, the sort of last of the classical Romans, who wrote entirely in Greek, but he was a consul. Both his sons were consuls of Rome, and he was incarcerated for dissent from the Ostrogoth. I'm pretty sure it was Ostrogoth king who was responsible for the final collapse of the Western Roman Empire. But he was put into prison and finally executed. But whilst in prison, he wrote this extraordinary, enduring classical work of the Western canon, which is the consolation of philosophy. And while he's in prison, he has this imaginary conversation with Lady Philosophy, who is a sort of a Beatrice-like figure from Dante's Inferno. And she really says to him, your problem is not your circumstances, because he was very down about it, depressed and self-pity about this massive collapse in his circumstances. But she said, your problem is amnesia, as you have forgotten what it means to be a man. And I think the same is true for us. We have forgotten the magnificence of our own inheritance as a culture. Marcus Aurelius in the Meditations sort of says, sort of talking to himself, Emperor of Rome. He said, if you will only return to reason, those who have been calling you an ape within 10 days will call you a god. And he said, it took 10 days to turn it around if we return to reason. All of our injuries are entirely self-inflicted, and as a matter of logic, can be turned around within 10 days. So I haven't given up hope.
Okay, well, on that note, we'll end it here. And is there anything you would like to let people know how to contact you, or anything?
Well, look, we're very always welcoming people to the Liberal Democrats New South Wales. You can follow Lib Dem New South Wales on Twitter. That's where their sort of intellectual content comes out. I encourage people to find John Ruddock at John Ruddock 2, I think he is, on Twitter. Hosting a radio show on Sunday night, 7 to 9 p.m. Australian Eastern Standard Time, where you can find me at tntradio.live. Always happy to have another listener. Otherwise, if I bump into you in Martin Place on my way to catch a train, say good day.
Okay, well, thank you very much for joining me, and I hope to talk to you again soon.
Thanks, Daniel.